Isaiah chapter 20, if you have your Bible, open up there. We're going to cover two chapters tonight because Isaiah chapter 20 is very short. And of these two chapters, one is kind of weird. If you read ahead, it's probably one of the weirdest chapters in the Bible. It's the weirdest chapter in Isaiah. And then chapter 21 is fascinating because it's one of the most amazing prophecies in this book too. So we're going to continue looking at the burdens or the oracles. You remember these heavy prophecies against the nations that Judah was looking to try and confederate with, to associate with for protection. God has constantly told them, I will be your protector. I will be your shield. I will be the one that takes care of you. And yet they're doing what most human beings do. Who can help me? Who can be a buffer? Who can go in between? Do you remember that the northern tribe, the northern kingdom of Israel, and Syria were trying to join together and force Judah to join them to stand against the Assyrians? Everybody was afraid of the Assyrian threat. Everybody was looking for allies, and God continues to speak through the prophet Isaiah to Judah and say, I am your ally. I am your fortress. I am your bulwark. I am what you need. You don't need these other people. And so these burdens, these prophecies against these other nations were messages to Judah more than to the other nations. Isaiah is speaking to Judah and saying, this is what's going to happen to this nation if you try to depend upon them. And this is what will happen to that nation if you try to depend upon them. And this is what's going to happen to the other nation. Any nation you choose is going to fall. Any nation you choose is going to come short because it's men. And I am the Almighty, and I am the one that can protect you from the Assyrians. So these burdens are listed from chapter 13 to 23, and we're kind of in the middle of them. This chapter contains a prophecy where Isaiah predicts the destruction of the Egyptians and the Ethiopians by the Assyrians. They're trying to join with these peoples, these nations, to try and protect themselves, defend themselves from the Assyrians. And God says, it's no good. The Assyrians are going to take them. They're going to fall. And if you're with them, you're going to fall too. So we had prophecies against Egyptians and Ethiopians in a couple of preceding chapters. But we start out in verse 1, and it says, in the year that Tartan came to Ashdod, when Sargon, the king of Assyria, sent him, and he fought against Ashdod, and he took it. So verse 1 is kind of giving us the political setting for this prophecy. It describes the time when the army of Assyria conquered a Philistine city named Ashdod. You remember it was one of the 5 cities of the Philistine along the coastal plain there. And Isaiah's sign, the sign that God gave to Isaiah, was a response to this victory of Assyria. The name Tartan there literally is a title. It means the commander-in-chief. So King Sargon sent his commander-in-chief with his army down to attack this Philistine city, and he was able to take it. Ashdod was formerly a Philistine city. It's now a seaport in Israel. And some of you have probably heard the name several times because it seems that missiles from Gaza can reach Ashdod, and they've done some damage there. But the Lord at this time spoke to Isaiah and asked him to do something unusual. How many read the chapter?
Just now.
Okay, a couple of you already know what the unusual thing is. Oftentimes, God will ask his prophets to do strange things. I'll just call them weird things, okay? You remember Jeremiah had the rotten robe. Do you remember Jeremiah's rotten robe? He had this beautiful robe. God told him to go buy this beautiful, it's like a white 3-piece suit, right? And he's wearing it into town, and everybody's looking at him and go, Jeremiah, man, you're looking good. And then he was to take it to a river and bury it under a rock in the mud and leave it there until it was moldy and smelly and everything else. Then God said, now go back and put on the robe and wear it again into town where you saw the people before. And he's wearing it into town, and people are going, what happened to you? What happened to that nice suit of clothes? What happened to that beautiful robe? And he said, well, it's a picture. It's the nation of Israel. You were once beautiful and clean and blessed by God, but now you're dirty and moldy and stinky because you've turned away from the things of God. Another time Ezekiel, they weren't single times with these two guys. Ezekiel was told to dig a hole in the front wall of his house. So he's digging this hole, and people are coming by, and they go, you ever heard of a door? And he goes, yeah, but you know what? Time is coming when you won't be able to use the doors of the gates of Jerusalem. You'll be digging holes through the wall to escape. And so it was a sign. It was something to make people ask questions. Do you remember Ezekiel had to lay on his side for several days and throw rocks at a model city? Hosea had to put up with a trying marriage. But Isaiah, as far as we can follow in the text, Isaiah was only asked to do one of these models one time, and this is it. And so, of course, the fall of Ashdod would certainly make, very close to Judah now, it would certainly make Judah think, we're next, and we need protection. Who can we lean on? So the Lord gives Isaiah a sign to act out. Verse 2, at the same time, at the time of the attack in verse 1, at the same time the Lord spoke by Isaiah, the son of Amos, saying, go and remove the sackcloth from your body. Take your sandals off your feet. And so he did, walking naked and barefoot. Now, during this period, God instructed his prophet to dramatize the message. He was to take off his clothes, including his shoes. And as you can imagine, this might be embarrassing, to say the least, humiliating a little bit. Somebody said, but it's the naked truth. Sometimes we're embarrassed to share the truth, aren't we? I think there's an object lesson for us here. We're embarrassed to share the truth. Think about it. How did Isaiah feel when God asked him to do this? Is that you, Lord? Is that really you, Lord? How did Jesus feel, who is the truth, on the cross? I know we try to cover him up when they do crucifixes and pictures and things like that, but that's not normally how the Romans did things. We know that they took his clothes and divided them among themselves, the Roman soldiers. But the Lord said, just as my servant Isaiah walked naked and barefoot 3 years for a sign and a wonder against Egypt and Ethiopia. Here's the reason you did it. It was against Egypt and Ethiopia. Now, there's some debate on this, and as you read commentaries, you'll see people that say, God wouldn't ask somebody to do that. Actually, what he did, and they're making conjecture, they're saying what he actually did was he took off the sackcloth, but he still had his underwear on. So he's really walking around in his underwear. I don't see that in the text, okay? Others say, well, he did it at certain points to make a point, and at other times he was able to wear his clothes over that 3-year period. I don't see that in the text. And you know, it really doesn't matter what the debate is there. The thing is, however God did it, Isaiah was willing to do what the Lord asked him to do. So that's the main thing. This is going to be embarrassing, but it's going to be a sign to Judah of what is going to happen to the Ethiopians and to the Egyptians. They will be embarrassed. Just as this would be embarrassing, they will be embarrassed. And Judah, you're going to be embarrassed too, because you had thought to use them for your protection, for your help, for your aid. And you're going to find out that was foolish, and you're going to be embarrassed for even thinking that you could find help from them. So shall the king of Assyria lead away the Egyptians as prisoners, and the Ethiopians as captives, young and old, naked and barefoot, with their buttocks uncovered, to the shame of Egypt. That's what gives me even a greater idea that in the text we see that he's naked and uncovered. And the sign announces the fulfillment and humiliation of Egypt and Ethiopia. So for 3 years, Isaiah parades around as God had instructed to portray the condition of the Egyptian and Cushite captives that the Assyrians had taken. Now, I've mentioned before that the Assyrians were very cruel people. And this was one of their methods that they used as a conquering army to disgrace and to humiliate the conquered people. They literally would strip them down and march them naked. They would put fish hooks in their jaws. They would tie them together with ropes, and you would have these long lines of people being pulled by hooks in their jaws, being totally humiliated as they're marched to wherever the Assyrians wanted them to go. So the intended effect on the Jews was to shock them and to shame them for their trust and dependence upon those two nations. Verse 5, then they shall be afraid and ashamed of Ethiopia, their expectation, and Egypt, their glory. They, again, is Judea here. Judea is going to be afraid because, again, these people we thought we could trust, these people we thought could help us, aren't going to be able to. We've seen that they are no strength or power at all. And Ethiopia was our expectation. We expected them to help us. We knew that Egypt was powerful. At one point, Egypt was just as powerful as Assyria, but no glory there. They can't help us. And it became evident how foolish it was for Judah to look to them for protection. And verse 6, the inhabitant of this territory will say in that day, surely such is our expectation. Wherever we flee for help to be delivered from the king of Assyria, how shall we escape? Now, I don't know if you've ever felt like that in your life. You get into a situation, you think, where am I going to go? What can I do? I think about that often when we see the world going the way it's going, even our own country. It's like, well, where can I go? Can we move out of the country? Well, I don't know. Where would we go? Where would be better? Where can we find help? Where's our expectation? It better be, what he's telling us here, it better be in the Lord. That's our expectation. That's our hope. Judah would say, where can we go now? How can we escape? How can we be delivered from Assyria? And I believe the Lord allowed them to be backed into a corner, caught between two mighty empires, Egypt and Assyria, without being able to trust either one. There was no escape except in the Lord. So in effect, I find it interesting, God would have Isaiah become a streaker as a sign of what was to come to these nations. And this is why Isaiah is saying, don't make a league with Egypt or Ethiopia, they will fall. If you look to man, if you look to the arm of flesh, you will fail. And I believe God is saying the same thing to us today. We should look to him for our strength, for our help, and for our defense. Look up. You know, even believers that are caught today looking around, listening to the news. Oh, what's going to happen? What's going to go on with our economy, and what's going to happen with the world as these wars go on and rumors of wars, and boy, they're going to come here next. What are we going to do? Don't look to the flesh. Don't look to the arm of man to help you. Further on here, shortly in Isaiah 26, Isaiah writes, you will keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on you, because he trusts in you. There's the answer. You want peace? Put your mind, put your thoughts on the Lord. Look up, your redemption draws nigh. Psalm 18, David writes, the Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my strength in whom I will trust, my shield and the horn of my salvation and my stronghold. And then David writes again in Psalm 62, he only is my rock and my salvation. He is my defense. I will not greatly be moved. I don't have to be shaken by these things because I know the Lord. What an advantage we have over the rest of the world. Listening to the political pundits and the media trying to grab our attention, and you don't know who to believe anymore. Who can you trust? Who can you believe? The Lord and his word only. Psalm 91, Moses writes, I will say of the Lord, he is my refuge and my fortress, my God, in him will I trust. That's why I love that song that we sang tonight so much, because it reminds me of who the Lord is in my life. And whenever I'm feeling down or afraid or wondering where I'm going to run, I remember I don't have to run anywhere except to the Lord, because he is my strength and in him I'll trust. These are scriptures that we know. You've all read these before and we know them, but we need to know them in our heart. We need to believe them. We need to trust in the word of the Lord, not just in our head. Now, chapter 21 is going to be the second oracle or burden against Babylon. He's already shared a burden against Babylon, but he begins this particular prophecy and addresses it to Babylon. The great plain of Babylon was divided with lakes and marshes, so it was referred to in ancient times as a sea. And the title probably refers to the flat Mesopotamian plain near the Persian Gulf, which both the Assyrian and Babylonian empires occupied. It was basically a desert, basically still is a desert with a river running through it. The mighty river Euphrates. And of course, there's that other river up there too. Everybody remember what the other river's called?
Mesopotamia.
What?
Mesopotamia.
Tigris River. Tigris and Euphrates were the two that run through Mesopotamia. Okay? So the burden against the wilderness of the sea. He's speaking of Babylon. As the whirlwinds in the south pass through, so it comes from the desert and a terrible land. Now the south of Babylon, if you look on a map, is the Arabian desert. And this is an extension of the Saharan desert. The Saharan desert is huge. It covers most of North Africa, and it extends up around the Mediterranean into Arabia. And this Arabian desert is infamous for its barrenness and its heat. And what he's saying here is the fulfillment of this prophecy is going to be like a sirocco. We have those winds here, don't we? They just suddenly come up and tear down all the fences and rip off all the roofs in Fontana, and then it stops, right? Just suddenly it's there, it destroys things, and it's gone. And they have mentioned in the New Testament, Paul faced storms on the Mediterranean. It was called Euroclydon, right? It just suddenly comes up and sinks ships. Paul got in shipwrecks all the time, and then it calms down immediately. Well, there's this sirocco, this hot desert wind that'll blow up from the south, blow up from the Arabian desert, and it's going to destroy Babylon, and it's going to be like a hot, destructive wind that blows through the country. This is something the Jews could relate to because they knew about the wind that blows up from the Negev, and did the same thing in Israel too, periodically. So we go on in verse 2, a distressing vision is declared to me. The treacherous dealer deals treacherously, and the plunderer plunderers. Go up, O Elam, besiege, O Media. It's all its signing I have made to cease. All its sighing I have made to cease. Now this is interesting because we think back, who's the major force in the world as Isaiah is speaking? It's Assyria. Is Babylon any big deal right now in this time period? No. But Isaiah is already speaking of Babylon becoming a world power and being destroyed by somebody named Elam. Anybody know who Elam is? Elam is an old name for Persia, which is a modern country named Iran. So they're in here a long time ago. They're going to become a power. So before Babylon's even a power, before it's even reached its place of ascendancy, 100 years before that, while Assyria is still the major power, and because we're in the time we live in, we know that Babylon destroys Assyria and becomes the first world power. But we know that Elam, or Persia, Media and Persia, are going to grow up from these little tribes. They're nomadic tribes. They're nothing. They haven't even called themselves Persians yet, but they're going to grow up. They're going to bind together, and they're going to defeat Babylon, who has not yet defeated Assyria, because right now it's nothing. And these people are less than nothing, and Isaiah is giving a prophecy. So Assyria's in power, Babylon's unimportant, but the prophecy is about Babylon being destroyed. After it destroys Assyria, it's going to be destroyed by Elam, or Iran. So at this time, the Elamites didn't have an identity as Persians. They were nomads living in tents, and the same was true for Media. Now we know that the Medo-Persians would eventually come together to overthrow the Babylonians. But at the time of this prophecy, nobody would have thought that. Most of the people in the world didn't know about these two little nomadic tribes. Who cares? What are they in the scope of world things? What are they compared to Babylon, who's just an upstart and really not that big a deal? What are they compared to Assyria, who's all powerful right now? What are they compared to Egypt? Well, God has a plan. God has something he's going to do. And this is an amazing prophecy here. It's an eternal proof of the validity of the inspiration of Scripture. How would anybody know apart from inspiration by the Spirit of God? They wouldn't. So they're going to go up against this foe and put an end to her evil ways that produce groaning in her victims. And it's interesting that many years before the event, Media was just a small tribe. And the fulfillment, no way that any man in that day could foresee these two tribal provinces becoming a world power and destroying the tremendous empire of Babylon. But that's exactly what happened historically. And what God is saying is to them and to us, I know things you don't know. I know what's in the future. You and I can say, I don't know what the future holds, but I know who holds the future. He knows what's going on. So it's interesting the effect that this particular vision had on Isaiah. It would seem at times that the prophecy would have physical effects on him. As he spent time with the Lord, sometimes we read that he was in great weakness, spending time in prayer and communion with the Lord. It seemed it was physically draining to have this kind of close relationship with God. God speaking to you, and the effect would be physically draining. Daniel speaks of this same kind of thing. Daniel chapter 7. Do you remember that he had a set of visions from the Lord, and he said, I was on my bed. My head was spinning. I was drained from all of this. So Daniel spoke about how he felt his beauty had turned into ugliness and how the presence of God had an adverse physical effect. And Isaiah describes that here. He says, I saw this vision. I saw what's going to happen to Assyria. I saw what's going to happen to Babylon. I saw what's going to happen to Elam and Media. And my loins were filled with pain. Pangs have taken hold of me like pangs of a woman in labor. I was distressed when I heard it. I was dismayed when I saw it. So obviously he had more than just hearing the voice of the Lord. He had a vision from the Lord of these things. And my heart wavered. Fearfulness frightened me. The night for which I longed had turned into fear for me. So this is the physical reaction that Isaiah had, seeing the vision of the Medo-Persian Empire conquering the Babylonian Empire. And he's in serious pain, filled with fear. This also describes another reaction that we'll see later on. Do you remember Belteshazzar? Daniel chapter 5. He's living in Babylon. This is several years later, over 100 years later. He thinks he's completely secure in this city. Do you remember the walls are 300 feet high? Think about that for just a minute, okay? As long as a football field is, stand it up on end. That's the walls of Babylon, okay? It was 80 feet thick. They would have chariot races on the top of the wall. Why? There was enough room. Plenty of room to do this thing. So we've got walls 80 feet thick, 300 feet high. Who's going to come through here? Who's going to get inside? We're completely secure. We can live in here. We've got farmland. We've got water. We've got the river Euphrates going through. Who could ever take us? So they know an enemy's outside. They knew that people were trying to take the city, but they didn't care. He had a party. He invited all of his leaders. And they were feasting and drinking. And he finally decided to call for the vessels of the temple. You remember his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar had brought those from Israel. Those vessels that were dedicated to the service of God in the temple. And they began to drink out of them. And suddenly a hand comes out, just a hand, and it starts writing on the wall. Would that freak you out a little bit? I think it would me. But the hand comes out and it starts writing on the wall, and it says, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. The Lord has judged your kingdom. You're going to lose your land. You've been weighed in the balances and found wanting, or that could even be translated, you're a lightweight, especially compared to the Lord. You may think you're all powerful, but you're a lightweight, and your kingdom will be taken from you today. That's the last word there. So we'll expand on this even further when we get to chapters 44 and 45. Even Isaiah goes to the point of naming the conquering general 150 years before he was born. Isaiah knew the name. He knew how the city would be taken. He speaks of how the Euphrates would be diverted, and they would come in on the banks of the river and through the levied gates, and they'd be unlocked. And we get to chapter 45, and we'll take some time to look at the historical record in the conquering of Babylon by Cyrus, and it's exactly as Isaiah described it. So he indicates that it is suddenly in the midst of their revelry, the night of pleasure was turned into fear. Remember the night that Babylon fell, Belshazzar was secure in his fortifications, but he is about to become very insecure. I love the old King James. It says his knees smote one against another. Modern vernacular, his knees were knocking. Even probably a little more crude, he lost it all right there. You've been weighed, you're not good enough, your kingdom is taken from you. So prepare the table, set the watchmen in the tower, eat and drink. Arise, you princes, anoint the shield, or put oil on your shield, grease the shield. That was for battle. You would put grease or oil on your shield so it would deflect arrows and deflect spears or swords of the enemy coming. So suddenly in the midst of the banquet, a cry from the watchtower, come, grease your shields, make your blades strong. In the midst of the party, the watchman cries out, for thus has the Lord said to me, go set a watchman, let him decree what he sees. He saw a pair of chariots, a pair of horsemen, a chariot of donkeys, a chariot of camels. And he listened earnestly with great care. Then he cried, a lion, my Lord. Or that could be translated too. He cried like a lion. He cried loud. He was upset. He was scared. I stand continually on the watchtower in the daytime. I've set my post every night. Interesting too that when Daniel had his vision of the world governing empires, the lion was representative of Babylon. But he goes on and says, what I have heard from God, that I have declared to you. Reminds us of a passage in Revelation 14 where the destruction of commercial Babylon and spiritual Babylon takes place. Do you remember that an angel cries out, Babylon is fallen, is fallen. And this prophecy would have encouraged the Judeans to put their trust in God rather than the Babylonians, because Babylon would too come to an end. Then he goes on in verse 11 and he says, the burden against Duma. He calls to me out of Seir. Watchman, what of the night? Watchman, what of the night? Duma is an ancient name for Idumea. Remember Idumea? That's a name for Edom. Remember Edom? He's Israel's brother. Esau, the brother of Jacob, Israel. They settled in the land of the southeast of Israel and were sometimes the enemies of Israel. This is the modern day area of Jordan. Okay? And Jordan's going to come into play in the last days. We know Petra's there. A lot of things are going to happen there. But there's a word play here. Duma literally means silence. And the watchman doesn't have a word for those calling out from Duma or from Idumea or from Edom or from Esau. He's saying, it's going to be day, but there's going to be a lot more night before the day comes. And so be prepared. You can come and ask later because I don't have an answer for you right now. Kind of silent. You ever have those nights where you're not feeling well, you're in bed, you're sick, and you just can't sleep, and you're waiting for the morning to come? How long till morning gets here? What time is it now? What, only 5 minutes have gone since the last time I looked? How much longer do I have to deal with this? I can't even call the doctor yet. This is horrible. How long is this night going to last? That's what's being expressed here. That's what Duma is expressing. How long are we going to be in this night? How long are we going to be under this pressure? How long are we going to be under this bondage? And so Edom, feeling the oppression of Assyria, is calling out to the prophet to ask him how much longer this oppression must endure. And the watchman said, the morning comes, and also the night, if you will inquire, return and come back. So he's responding and saying, there is hope. The morning will come. Morning is coming, the day star's on his way, but there were more bad things coming. Daylight's coming, but there's still darkness. And the Edomites could request more information in the future. Edom would experience a kind of darkness that would last a long time before her night would pass, even though there's a promise of better times. So therefore, it would be foolish for Judah to trust Duma or Edom. They weren't going to be a help. They were going to have some bad times. Verse 13, the burden against Arabia. In the forest in Arabia you will lodge, O you traveling companies of Dedanites. Saudi Arabia today was originally made up of two major tribal families, those of Sheba and those of Dedan. So he mentions the Dedanites here. They're linked together in a passage in Ezekiel. We'll get there later on. And when we look into the book of Ezekiel, we'll read the prophecy of the coming invasion of Israel by Russia and her allies. And it's important to note that Iran comes with Russia in the invasion. Saudi Arabia does not. We are suspicious of Saudi Arabia. Why? The majority of the 9/11 terrorists came from Saudi Arabia. But the Bible is letting us know that's not the real problem. They're actually going to protest what Russia is doing. There's a concern today that Russia may move into Saudi Arabia to take oil supplies, but Saudi Arabia is listed with those nations that will ask Russia, what are you doing? You're going to find out that in Ezekiel 38, the protest comes from Tarshish. Some Bible scholars believe that Tarshish is Spain, and they've written massive amounts of papers and books on it. Others believe that it's England, and they've written massive amounts of papers and books on it too. If it were England, Ezekiel talks about Tarshish and her young lions, or her offspring. We don't know who the offspring of Spain is, but we know the offspring of England would likely mean the United States, Canada, New Zealand, Australia. None of these nations will stop the invasion that's coming. None of these nations will fight against the invasion that's coming, but they will all protest. And one who will protest vehemently is Saudi Arabia. They're going to protest all this. The problem is going to be Russia, Iran, Turkey, Libya, and some of those others that are listed in Ezekiel. So verse 14, O inhabitants of the land of Tema, bring water to him who is thirsty. With their bread they met him who fled. So Isaiah is picturing the refugees from the attack on Arabia. For they fled from the swords, from the drawn sword, from the bent bow, and from the distress of war. They're fleeing from the Assyrian attack. And it had an immediate fulfillment. In verse 16, the Lord says, for thus says the Lord has said to me, within a year, according to the year of a hired man, the glory of Kedar will fail. The glory of a hired, according to the year of a hired man. In other words, if you were an indentured servant, you were doing a year's servant, you would keep a very strict calendar, wouldn't you? I've got this many more days left. Those of you that have been in the military, we all did that, didn't we? How long you got? I'm a short timer, 30 days. I got short time, I'm 10 days. We kept very close track of how long before we got out of our indenture, right? And so he's saying, if you count the time, if you count the year, you're going to find it's less than a year. And the remainder of the number of archers and the mighty men of the people of Kedar will be diminished, for the Lord God of Israel has spoken it. So within a year, these Arabians would suffer destruction. Their army would be dissolved. The end would be due to the sovereign Lord, not to the opposing armies. And the Lord himself assured the prophet of this. So the place that refugees were advancing, Gentile armies would seek security, and Arabia would prove insecure. Once again, God is saying, you can't trust Arabia. Yeah, they're down south. They're near Edom. They're near Duma. But you can't trust Duma. You can't trust Arabia. You can't trust anybody except me. That's the ongoing message. Nobody in the world's going to be able to help you. Nobody in the world's going to be able to protect you. Nobody's going to deliver you but the Lord. And we know, thank God, not through their own efforts, but because he's a God of grace and a God who keeps his covenant and keeps his commitment, that he has delivered them, and we know even now he will deliver them. So this is where we're going to end tonight. Next week, chapter 22, Isaiah turns his attention towards Jerusalem. And again, a very interesting chapter. So let's all stand together. Let's pray